Good evening, everybody. I'm a believer in starting on time, so it is the half hour. I'm sure others will be joining us, and I can see a few in the waiting room, but let's make a start. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Cilla Ross. I'm principal of the Co-operative College in Manchester, and I'm also honoured to be a trustee of the UK Society for Co-operative Studies. This lecture is one of the great lectures that UKSCS always holds in Cooperatives Fortnight, and people remember the slogan this year is "Keep Cooperating," which is a fantastic notion. It's something indeed we need to do more so than ever in these difficult times. Just a few housekeeping notes before I introduce our speaker. Again, I think probably most people now are quite comfortable with Zoom. What we're going to do this evening, because there are a large number on the call, is that you have two ways you can ask questions. You can either ask a question of Andrew in the chat, and if you do that, could you please put a couple of asterisks in front of that. The other option is to complete a form, which Chris is going to put the link in for now. You can just click on that, and that will take you to a form where you can put in your question, and then I can have a look at what's being asked. As you can see the form there, you just don't need to put your name in necessarily. You can ask the question, and then I will have a look, and hopefully you have a bit of support fielding some of those questions. Ruth may help me, and we'll ask Andrew to respond to them. My understanding is that Andrew's going to speak to us for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be lots of opportunity to ask questions. And I know that Andrew really needs very little introduction, because he's a wonderful cooperator and a fantastic writer and journalist, and it's an absolute pleasure for him to be doing this for UKSCS this evening. What the title is Reassessing the Early Productive Cooperatives, Worker Democracy Then and Now. And what Andrew's going to do is tell us an extraordinary story that, as a really brilliant researcher, he's uncovered and tells so impeccably well. So I have great pleasure in introducing Andrew and saying welcome, and thank you very much indeed, Andrew.
Well, thank you very much, Cilla, and a big thank you to the UK Society for Co-operative Studies for giving me the opportunity tonight to give this talk. Yes, as Cilla was saying, my focus is going to be on the productive cooperatives, as they were called, the productive cooperatives of the later 19th century, the antecedents of what today we would call workers' co-ops. So in other words, I'm going to be talking not about those mills and factories which were run by the owner who had put in the capital, which obviously was a very common model, particularly in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, nor those businesses which were run by managers on behalf of shareholders, which was the model of joint stock companies, which came in the middle of the 19th century, but something else. Businesses which in some sense were run by and for the workers who worked there. And actually this was what was called at the time self-employment. Now I'm going to suggest that productive cooperation is an important part of the history of the British cooperative movement, and I think arguably of our wider social history too. But it's also history which has very much been forgotten. And I may have a few suggestions as to why, just possibly, that history has been forgotten, why it was perhaps a little embarrassing, and why some people found it convenient to forget the story. But anyway, before we plunge back into the 19th century, I thought I would start by taking you back to the later 1970s and start with a personal note, because as everyone who lived through the 1970s and that period will know, this was a time of great political excitement, political change, great hope, and like a lot of other people, I was caught up in the excitement, the creativity of those years. And I was also attracted to the idea of working cooperatively. And I worked at that time for a small media project with a manager and 6 staff. And I was convinced that the way forward really for us was to convert that into a co-op. And I certainly managed to persuade some of my colleagues, but maybe not surprisingly, I didn't manage to persuade my boss, and I didn't manage to persuade his board of trustees. But anyway, a short time after that, I moved on, and with two good friends, I was involved in setting up a cooperatively run bookshop. So I learnt about working cooperatively, and I learnt about running a business in practice there at that bookshop. And I suppose the question really is, where did we look for inspiration? Where did we get the idea that this was possible from? Well, there were various things going on in the UK at that time. There were networks like In the Making, which some people may well remember. And I remember also being very influenced by the ideas which were coming out of the States. There was a book called No Bosses Here, which I read avidly at the time. But where we didn't get the inspiration from was the existing cooperative movement in the UK. We didn't get inspiration from the retail movement. And if I'm honest, I have to say that we were pretty sniffy about the state of the co-op movement at that time. We saw tired retailers, we saw businesses which didn't seem to have much principle left in them. For example, my local co-op seemed to have no qualms about selling outspan oranges. And if you remember, that was the time of the boycott against South African apartheid goods. So we didn't take inspiration, I don't think, from that part of the movement. And we certainly didn't have inspiration from the earlier examples of productive cooperation, of people, of workers trying to run their own businesses in the early years of the cooperative movement. And we didn't take inspiration from that because we literally didn't know about that history. And maybe a confession at this point that it's really only in the last few years, in the last 4 or 5 years, that I've actually learnt that history. It had very much sunk without trace. Well, I'm speaking tonight from my home, which is in Hebden Bridge, and that's in the north of England. If you don't know it, it's in the middle of the Pennines, very damp Pennines this evening. And I think we have a few people coming tonight from overseas, so I'll explain. It's halfway between Leeds and Manchester. It's an old mill town, a town which historically got its wealth from the textile trade. And when I moved here about 30 years ago, I quickly picked up a sort of low-level folk memory in the town that once upon a time, the place had had an important cooperatively run mill. But it was a story which hadn't really been properly told. I'm just going to change the screen a little bit. There we are, I think that's better. It was a story which really nobody seemed to know for sure. And in fact, sometimes the story was told wrongly. It was told that this was a co-op which had failed and had to be rescued, which actually is the complete reverse of the truth. So, as you do, I began a little desultory research. I was still hoping I could persuade somebody else to do the hard work of researching the story. But my efforts to try and persuade friends, twist arms, didn't come to anything. So I realized ultimately that if I wanted to get to the bottom of the story, I would need to do it myself. And so I did start a much more sort of systematic research into the story. And it was a story which surprised me. Because what I found was that there was indeed a successful, productive cooperative in Hebden Bridge back in the 19th century, one which it turned out had been nationally renowned in its time, in fact, even internationally known, and which went by the long title of the Hebden Bridge Fustian Manufacturing Cooperative Society Limited. And because this summer of 2020, is the 150th anniversary of the founding of that co-op in the summer of 1870, and because this lecture was originally going to be one of a series of events we'd arranged in Hebden Bridge to celebrate that anniversary, and because I've also seen on some of the pictures that there are people here from Hebden Bridge, I hope the rest of you will forgive me if I say something initially about that particular productive co-op. Well, it traded in fustian cloth, and in particular in ready-made fustian clothing. And fustian, I probably need to tell you, is very thick, heavy-duty cotton cloth, such cloth as moleskin and corduroy. And fustian actually in the late 19th century was as universal as, say, denim is today. It was really something which almost everyone, certainly everyone from the working classes wore. So the co-op was set up in the summer of 1870, ran successfully all the way through for 48 years, until eventually in 1918 it was subject to a takeover bid from the Cooperative Wholesale Society, and the CWS made an offer that the members at that point felt they couldn't resist. And the CWS were then running a mill in Hebden Bridge for a further half century. So this is a town with a century of cooperative production behind it. And if I'm clever now, I'm going to try and show you a picture of what this particular productive cooperative looked like at that point. Let's see whether we can organise the screen share. Okay. I've borrowed the laptop for tonight, so I'm having to find my way around it. But there you are. There's a view of the mill. It was called the Clough Mill, as it was in the late 1880s, so about 17, 18 years after the co-op had been founded. An important local employer, employed about 300 people. I think I'll also show you a picture too, if I can, of some of the workers in this particular co-op. Okay, so there you are. There's some of the women workers. It was a place of work for women as well as men, in the very top of the mill, making the ready-to-wear clothing. It was a successful co-op. Co-ops in those days did their accounts every 6 months, not every year. And if you look at the half-yearly accounts all the way through from 1870 to 1918, it made a profit every single year, which actually is not an achievement that many businesses manage, certainly not these days. But as well as being commercially successful, it was important and successful in other ways. Its leading light was a man who went on to play quite an important role in the national cooperative movement, and indeed in the international cooperative movement, because he was the treasurer of the International Cooperative Alliance during the very early years of its existence. This is the 1890s. And his name was Joseph Greenwood, a local man, a working class man, a man of very humble origins, born in 1833, born to parents who were hand loom weavers, extremely impoverished by that stage. And it meant that Joseph had very little opportunity for any formal education. He was obliged to start helping his parents when he was 7, and he learnt the trade of fustian cutting when he was 9. So Joseph Greenwood, a significant figure in the British cooperative movement. Another person from that particular co-op in Hebden Bridge who went on to the national movement, a man called Clement Gray, or J.C. Gray. And if you go to Hollyoake House in Manchester, which is the main office of Cooperatives UK, and indeed, as Scilla very well knows, of the Cooperative College, and you go up and down the stairs, you will pass the bust of J.C. Gray at the entrance to the building. So his bust is still there, but I think as a figure he's been almost entirely forgotten. He was the first secretary of the Hebden Bridge Fustian Co-op when he was about 20, appointed when he was about 20, worked there for 10 years, and then went across to Manchester to become initially the Deputy General Secretary of the Cooperative Union. That was the main federation of cooperatives. It's what has become Cooperatives UK today. And then from the early 1890s, he became the General Secretary in his own right. An interesting figure, I think. He played an important role in holding together really a movement which could be quite fractious, quite argumentative when it wanted to be. And J.C. Gray was also a key figure in the creation of the International Cooperative Alliance, the ICA. So 2 figures there from this particular co-op. I could also mention Robert Halsted. He found employment in the co-op as a four-loom weaver. And there's an account from a contemporary record of somebody visiting the weaving shed and seeing Halsted at his looms with a copy of John Ruskin, one of John Ruskin's books, propped up against the loom. So when he had a moment, he would be reading Ruskin. And Robert Halsted benefited enormously from the links which the co-op developed with Oxford University, which saw Oxford University dons coming to Hebden Bridge and the mill towns close by in the 1880s and 1890s, giving lectures on Saturday nights, which would sometimes attract hundreds and hundreds of people. And he also went to Oxford and Cambridge for summer schools for several years, almost the equivalent of what the Open University has been able to do. Halsted went to a lot of the summer schools. He was determined to try and ensure that working people could get decent education, and he went on to be one of the three founders of the WEA, the Workers' Educational Association. And actually later, we'll pick up the story later, because he went on from 1900 to become the General Secretary of the Co-operative Productive Federation, the CPF, and more about that in a little bit. And just in case you think I'm just mentioning men who came out of that co-op, I should also mention, I think, Martha Halliwell. Martha Halliwell was from Hebden Bridge, and because of the cooperative, she found herself at the Cooperative Congress in 1883, where the Women's Cooperative Guild was established, and ended up being one of the members of its first National Council, and indeed responsible for setting up the first branch of the Women's Cooperative Guild, which was in this town. So, okay, all in all, I think it's not surprising if Hebden Bridge Co-op came to be seen as something of an exemplar. And a quote which the co-op itself used, which came from the Rochdale local paper, the Rochdale Observer, said that co-operators look up to Hebden Bridge fustian workers in productive cooperation, just as they do to Rochdale in respect to distribution. The famous story of the Rochdale pioneers and their shop in Rochdale. This was suggesting that in terms of productive cooperation, the Hebden Bridge textile mill had a very similar role. Well, lots and lots of people came up here to try and see this mill, which workers were in some sense running for themselves, visitors from home and abroad. And we know that very often when Joseph Greenwood did the guided tour, which he often did, he would tell the story of how the co-op started. And the co-op started with the story of a death of a fellow worker of Greenwood's in a conventional textile mill not far away. It was 1870. Greenwood was working with an elderly man originally from Ireland, and one of the things they were doing was carrying fustian cloth, very heavy cloth, from one part of the mill to the other. The old worker, the old Irishman, really shouldn't have been working at all. He was too old for work, but he had no money, so he had to carry on working. He took the cloth one day and he suffered a heart attack. And it was obviously a deeply moving experience for Greenwood, and when you read his account of that episode, you see that it was for him representation of everything that was wrong about the way that work was conventionally organised. And there just had to be a better way of doing it. There just had to be some sort of alternative way to operate business. There was no family. The workmates chipped in threepence each for the funeral, and then they carried on chipping in threepence to establish a fustian co-op. That was, as I say, 150 years ago this summer. And Joseph Greenwood had, I think, been angling for this for some time. He'd been at Manchester for the second of the National Co-operative Congresses in June in 1870. This was the first major national congress which brought together the heartland of the movement, which was Lancashire and Yorkshire, with those in the south and London in particular who liked the idea of cooperation, mainly middle and upper middle class supporters of the idea of cooperation. So although there had been a conference in 1869, which is sometimes taken as the start of the Cooperative Union, it was the 1870 conference which brought together the strength of the movement. So let's take stock of where the movement was in 1870, and in some ways it was in a pretty good place. In terms of the distributive side of the movement, I'm talking about the grocery shops here, of course. Things had really moved on from 1844, the foundation of Rochdale Pioneers, and indeed those earlier cooperative stores that had predated Rochdale. There were hundreds and hundreds of local societies now up and down the country. They were often a very important part of the local economy, and they were a way of getting goods, food, clothing to ordinary people who really needed a shop they could go to where they could trust the goods. So the distributive movement in good heart. The Cooperative Wholesale Society, formed in 1863, bringing together, creating a network to supply the individual stores. CWS, 7 years on, doing well. CWS had actually begun a banking operation. It hadn't actually got an official banking license, but it was effectively operating a loan and saving business at that point. Insurance. Again, in the 1860s, the movement had established its own insurance arm, what became the Cooperative Insurance Society, and then went on later to become part of the CWS. We had, in 1862, a new Act of Parliament, the Industrial and Provident Societies Act. This was a revision of an earlier act, which for the first time really gave cooperative societies a level playing field with other forms of business. So that was an important step forward too. And then finally, well, not in 1870, but in 1871, we saw the creation of Cooperative News, which became a very important internal magazine, newspaper for the movement. So things looking pretty good in 1870, except to say that some people also had concerns about the way the movement was developing. Some people felt that the radical edge, which had been there in the early days, had gone. And one of those was somebody called Lloyd Jones. Sorry, I said Lloyd George. It wasn't Lloyd George. It was Lloyd Jones, who was a leading cooperative missionary, was the word which was used, tirelessly travelling the country, trying to proselytise for cooperation. And he said that he thought that there was now apathy about the true and complete meaning of the idea. And then the person who was at this point very active in the Cooperative Union became the General Secretary, a man by the name of Edward Van Sittert Neal. Neal was saying that he felt there was unbounded reverence for members for the goddess Divvy, for the dividend. In other words, the passion of radicalism had gone and people just wanted the money at the end of the 6 months. And I think there was also a concern that distributive cooperation, the shops, by itself wasn't really enough. And by the 1870s, by the 1880s in particular, some people were suggesting that the focus just on the grocery stores was taking attention away from productive cooperation. Now, productive cooperation wasn't a new idea. It had been integral to the movement right from the start. Before the Rochdale Pioneers, before 1844, we can note several attempts at productive cooperation in Lancashire and Yorkshire, places like Halifax and Huddersfield. And then if you go forward to the founding of the Rochdale Pioneers, if you look at their aims and principles, one of their aims was to open a store, but another of their aims was to undertake manufacturing to provide employment for their members. A few more years further on, the so-called Christian Socialists, this was a progressive theological circle around F.D. Morris, based down in the south, included Van Sittert Neal, it included the author Charles Kingsley, it included author Tom Hughes, Tom Brown School Days. They were engaged in quite a top-down way in creating productive cooperatives in the late 1840s and the early 1850s. I think possibly concerned at the Chartist movement and hoping there was some way to mitigate against the conflicts which they saw in society at that point. I can't resist mentioning Karl Marx, who commented on productive cooperation in 1864 in a very positive way. He spoke very favourably of, here's a quote, "cooperative factories raised by the unassisted efforts of a few bold hands. And he said that the value of these great social experiments cannot be overrated. So I think you can see that already there'd been significant history and a significant series of attempts, some more successful than others, at running productive cooperative businesses. But let's return now to 1870 and carry the story forward from there. And I think we can identify productive cooperation in Britain as settling down into two broad avenues, 2.5 broad avenues, because and the half is the small number of distributive societies, that's the grocery stores, who also carried on some manufacturing, as it were, as a sideline, and cabinet making was undertaken in Accrington, weaving was undertaken in Lee in Lancashire. The Darwin Society in just near Blackburn had a colliery, for example. So there was a small amount of productive cooperation happening through the distributive societies, but effectively two broad avenues. And the first of those were the independent productive societies, such as the Hebden Bridge Fustian Co-op. How many of these were there? Well, more than you might think, including quite a few, which, I mean, just like today in the workers' co-op world, didn't necessarily stay the course. They were very disparate. Some of those were started in quite a top-down way by the cooperative-minded great and the good, who thought that they knew best what workers wanted. Some were promoted by local societies, and there was also links with some of the early trade unions who were trying to find employment for their members. But there were also at least some, maybe at this point a relatively small number, of genuinely worker-led initiatives, which I think we can see as the embryonic origins of the workers' co-op tradition. And if you ask me to name names, well, I would certainly mention Hebden Bridge Fustian, founded in 1870, as I said. I'd probably mention Airedale Worsted, which was in Bradford, 1872. Coventry Watchmakers in 1876. Leicester Hosiery, which was also founded in 1876, which we'll come back to in a little while. And perhaps later, the Leicester Boot and Shoe Co-op. And the touchstone for those was that they were in some sense worker run, and that it should be the workers who benefited from the fruits of their labour. But there was a second avenue from 1873, and that route into cooperative manufacturing was undertaken by the Cooperative Wholesale Society. And in 1873 they opened their first factory, which was just outside Manchester at Crumpsall, quite a famous biscuit factory. The same year they opened a factory in Leicester making boots, and a year after that, in 1874, they opened a soap factory in Durham. And then there were further acquisitions in the 1880s and beyond. And incidentally, the Scottish Wholesale, the Scottish CWS, which at that stage was a separate society, also engaged in some manufacturing. So the mighty CWS's entry into production in 1873 immediately raised two key questions. What was the role and the power of the employees in its factories? And what was going to be the structuring of productive cooperation in the UK? So if we tackle the first of those, the issue of worker engagement. I mean, was Crumpsall, a biscuit factory, was the Leicester boot factory going to be a workplace just like any other conventional business, any other conventional workplace, or was it in some sense going to be a different, more cooperative way of working? Well, the CWS was a federation of societies. It was itself an independent cooperative society, but it was a second-tier cooperative with hundreds of members, individual local stores as members. And its legal structure meant that the factories were being run for the benefit, ultimately, of those member societies through the dividend it paid. So in that sense, the factories certainly weren't following the Hebden Bridge model, for example, of being worker run or run for the benefit of the workers. And this was controversial in the movement, as you can imagine. It cropped up immediately afterwards at the first Cooperative Congress in 1874, the first Congress after the opening of Crumpsall, where there was an impassioned debate about this. Lloyd Jones, I mentioned him earlier, complained that the workers in our so-called cooperative factories will be merely so many underlings of the staff of the wholesale. And he called on the CWS to give its workers a direct share in the profits, a voice and a vote in the management of their workplaces, and if they wanted, the right to invest their savings in their workshops. And Lloyd Jones was backed by Edward Vansittart Neale, General Secretary of the Cooperative Union, backed by various other senior figures in the cooperative movement, but opposed by senior figures in the CWS. And remember that the CWS was self-governing, it was independent, so actually it didn't really need to pay much attention to what Congress thought. Well, this particular time Congress decided it didn't support Lloyd Jones. The CWS would be free to progress as it pleased in its own factories. So, two main models. And I think those two main models created a lack of clarity, a lack of unity behind the idea of productive cooperation, and it certainly caused, year after year, plenty of antagonism, plenty of arguments. And this came particularly to a head over the argument for what was called bonus to labour, or in other words, should the workers get a share of the profits from their labours. This really was the big dispute of the later 19th century within the cooperative movement in the UK. It was you can hardly overstress how controversial it became. And I was going to say it was almost a doctrinal issue, and I think I would actually say it became actually a doctrinal issue within the movement. And this argument lasted 40 years or more. If you go back to the 1860s, by which stage the Rochdale pioneers had established their own manufacturing society, in 1862, at the height of the cotton famine, when cotton wasn't coming into the country, the investors in that society decided they wanted to stop paying bonus to labour for the workers in Rochdale. Again, a controversial decision. One of the early pioneers said it was the rapacity of rapaciousness, I think we would say today, of certain working men in Rochdale who, on becoming employers of labour, took the bounty off the workpeople at the so-called cooperative mill. So a live issue in 1862 in Rochdale, and a live issue still at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th. And there were some people like George Jacob Holyoake, a very significant figure, a very senior figure within the cooperative movement, who implied that you weren't really a genuine cooperator if you didn't support bonus to labour. And with him were people like Vansittart Neale, Tom Hughes, and certainly the independent societies, people like Joseph Greenwood from Hebden Bridge, Leicester Hosiery too. But on the other side of the argument were other leaders, other senior leaders within the cooperative movement. J.T.W. Mitchell of the CWS, William Nuttall of the CWS, to give two names. And although the CWS did experiment briefly with the idea of a profit-related bonus, they quite quickly abolished that, and I think they also approached it not as a matter of principle, but simply as a way of improving worker productivity, as a sort of profit-related pay type initiative. With the CWS on that side of the argument, later on was the powerful figure of Beatrice Webb, Beatrice Potter, as she was before she married, who weighed in very strongly against bonus to labour in the book she wrote on the cooperative movement. It's a very polemical book. I would probably describe it as rather snarky in the positions that she adopts, but certainly she had little time for the independent productive societies or for the idea of paying workers a bonus from the profits. And there were legitimate arguments on both sides of the argument. I mean, on one side, Holyoake, for example, argued that the whole point of the cooperative movement should be to liberate workers from their enslavement to capital. You know, capital is is doing all right. Capital is doing fine. The workers are chained to their desks whilst capital is swanning around. And was that the way it should be in a cooperative workplace, he was saying. On the other side, the argument from the CWS was that they were secondary co-op, they were a secondary cooperative. Their profits went back to the whole movement, not just to those individual workers who were lucky enough to work in a cooperative factory. Now, there were lots of arguments. I mean, I can't really go through them all now, and this is probably the moment where I can do a quick plug for my book. If you're interested in the arguments for and against, I do describe them in some detail in the book. But I guess the point is this, that in some ways the focus and that obsession with bonus to labour, with the profit sharing to labour, is quite curious, because in a cooperative business, profit is a pretty flexible concept. If you take a cooperative shop, you can reduce the prices at which you sell to your members, and you can reduce the profits and obviously reduce the dividend, or you can keep prices high, you can increase the profits and therefore increase the dividends. And it's the same too in a productive cooperative. I mean, you could pay your workers better wages, or you could improve the working conditions, in which case your profits would be diminished, or you could keep wages lower and increase the profits. So it's curious that bonus to labour became quite such a sort of key issue. And I think it did because it was a touchstone for something else, something more fundamental. And those who were arguing for bonus to labour were using that really as a shorthand for trying to defend what they saw as the soul of the movement, the soul of the 19th century cooperative movement, against those who they felt were trying to dilute the principles and the original radicalism. By and large, the independent productive cooperatives lined up on that side of the argument. And that's why in Hebden Bridge, for example, Joseph Greenwood was so angry and so adamant when in 1876, 6 years into the business, there was an attempt by the CWS to remove bonus to labour. It went to a vote, it was narrowly defeated. And that determination, certainly in Hebden Bridge and at most of the other independent cooperative societies at this time, that determination to maintain bonus to labour comes about even though, and this, what I'm about to say may surprise you, because those independent productive cooperatives were not actually giving workers all the profits. Unlike today's workers' co-ops, these early productive cooperatives tended to share the profits and, incidentally, their governance too, with other stakeholders in the business. And in fact, Hebden Bridge Fustian, for example, was structured as what we would now consider a multi-stakeholder cooperative. It very quickly became clear in the early weeks of the business that it would fail if it couldn't find more capital, so it brought in private investors. It also brought in other cooperative societies, the customers for its Fustian, as members too. So there were three categories of member. There were the worker members, and all members, men and women, were able to be admitted as full members of the co-op. There were the cooperative societies. There were 100 by 1876. And finally, there were some private investors too. And the profits were shared three ways between those three different stakeholder groups. Greenwood, I think, felt this was a compromise, which he would have preferred not to have had to do. He once said that the first object of the society was the redemption of the working people, not simply to serve the distributive societies. He felt that the highest level of productive cooperation was where the workers were entirely in control and entirely benefiting from the full profits. But he wasn't able to pull that off in the 1870s and the 1880s in Hebden Bridge. Later on in the century, newer productive cooperatives did manage to change things and become much closer to the model of workers' co-ops we know today. So this unfortunate divide between the two different models of productive cooperation continued, that of the independent societies and that of the wholesale, the CWS. Could things have been different? Well, J.C. Gray, I've mentioned J.C. Gray already, came from Hebden Bridge, went across to become Deputy General Secretary at Manchester of the Co-operative Union. He put forward quite a radical suggestion for what he thought would be a way forward for the movement as a whole in 1886 at the Congress, which was in Plymouth at that stage. And Gray's view was that each of the productive cooperatives in Britain should be independently constituted, they should be independent societies, that the CWS should turn its own factories into independent cooperative ventures, but there should be an element of federalism between all of them, and that should be achieved by the CWS having a minority shareholding in each of the societies and a representative on the board. So that's what Gray proposed for Hebden Bridge and for Leicester Hosiery and so on, and also for the CWS's own factories in Crumpsall and Leicester and Durham and so on. And actually it's an interesting model, and it's just possible it may ring a few bells, because that's the model which effectively is in operation in Mondragon in Spain, in the Basque Country in Spain. What J.C. Gray was proposing was something really very similar to what has worked so successfully for the cooperative economy in Mondragon. But it didn't get implemented. The CWS, as I said, was an independent society, could do what it wished, and it carried on doing it as it wished. There was an attempt by a small number of the independent societies to federate in the 1890s, without obviously the CWS being involved. But that idea, which would have been an interesting one had it happened, that fizzled out. So the disputes continued. There was a so-called Conciliation Cooperative Congress in 1895 in Huddersfield, but that didn't really settle the arguments, and effectively the movement went in two different directions. The independent productive cooperatives and their backers began to create their own structures away from the mainstream cooperative movement. And they increasingly talked not so much of cooperation, they talked of co-partnership. They created a propaganda vehicle for co-partnership, which was called the Labour Association, later to be known as the Labour Co-partnership Association. And actually, interestingly, it was very much the Labour Association, people around it who were trying to set up an international cooperative alliance in the 1890s as a way of promoting the co-partnership part of the movement internationally. At that stage, they didn't think the CWS should be a part of the ICA. That's sort of an aside, really. They created also the Cooperative Productive Federation, CPF, and Robert Halsted, the four-loom weaver who'd gone to the summer schools at Oxford and Cambridge, who'd been one of the founders of the WA, went down to Leicester where the CPF was based and became its General Secretary in 1900. I think the 1890s and 1900s were in some ways the heyday of that activity. A cohort of new wave ventures, not necessarily tied to the multi-stakeholder structures of the previous 2 decades, and with model rules which actively encouraged worker representation on the boards. And increasingly too, the focus moved away from this part of the country, from Lancashire and Yorkshire, and moved down to the Midlands, particularly to Northampton, Northamptonshire, Kettering in particular, and Leicester. CPF started a loan fund, shades of what we have today in the movement. Bernard Shaw was one of the investors, and it was used to invest in productive cooperatives to try and help them find the capital they needed from a sympathetic source. But we do need to recognise that that strand was much the smaller of the two co-op streams, and the mainstream was clearly the retail sector and the CWS, which was servicing that sector. The CWS, the great, effectively a multinational cooperative by that stage. And I guess that after the bitterness of the bonus to Labour debate, after the deaths of Van Sittert Neal and J.T.W. Mitchell from the CWS and Holyoake himself, when the 20th century started moving forward, I think there was a desire in the mainstream movement of the society not to worry too much about productive co-ops. Wasn't that they were deliberately written out of the story, but it just somehow seemed better to progress without worrying too much about them. And in any case, one by one, the independent societies were falling prey to the CWS, which was in acquisitive mood by this stage. The CWS acquired in the early years of the 20th century the independent flour mill societies, the cooperative flour mills. It acquired the Cooperative Insurance Society. It very controversially acquired Leicester Hosiery, which was a sort of beacon for independent societies. That was in 1902 to 3. And it acquired it effectively by saying to the members, well, if you don't accept our takeover, we'll come along and open our own mill alongside and be your competitor. And in fact, it also acquired the Hebden Bridge Fustian Society in 1918, at the very end of the First World War, even though the Hebden Bridge Society had been making whopping great profits in the previous few years. So productive cooperatives began to disappear from the story. I think it's a pity because, as I said, those of us in the 1970s who were attracted to the idea of workers' cooperation, workers' co-ops, didn't know anything of that past history. And I'm going to wind up quite shortly, but I do want finally to say that I think there was another loss that was suffered when the practical achievements of the worker-run productive co-ops became forgotten. And this is in relation to the debates in the labour movement about the way forward for public ownership of business. Because although there were some in the co-partnership world who saw co-partnership as a convenient way of suppressing class conflict and promoting social harmony and sort of reconciling labour and capital and so on, there was also a much more radical position, represented a left position, if you will, which saw bottom-up workplace democracy as, in some sense, prefigurative of the way that business could be structured in the golden future, which many in the labour movement believed could be achieved in the 20th century, in that new 20th century. So in other words, perhaps a managerial model of state ownership of nationalised industries wasn't the only model for businesses which were to be run for public benefit and not for private profit. Perhaps the experiences of places like the textile mill in Hebden Bridge had something to contribute as well. And there was an interesting and very heated exchange in an obscure journal in 1899 between Robert Halsted, ex-Hebden Bridge Co-operative Productive Federation, and a Fabian by the name of Henry McCrosty, with McCrosty holding up the standard Fabian position for state ownership, one which the Webb, Sidney and Beatrice Webb themselves strongly advocated. And Halsted, by contrast, arguing for an organisation of work which gave power to workers, which gave some sort of role for workers. And in fact, he criticised the idea of state ownership as potentially providing very little democracy except an exchange from capitalistic to official domination from the top, with the same disinherited wage earners at the bottom. Well, okay, we could we could explore that argument at great length. We know that in the 20th century it was the Fabian position which was taken up by the Labour Party and which led to the post-Second World War nationalisations. But maybe now, when we've seen some of the limitations of that model, we also need to look back to what Robert Halsted was advocating, that bottom-up approach based on direct worker engagement in their workplace. I'm going to wrap up. How can we summarise the early productive co-ops in the UK? I think we can say that they may have been small numerically, but I think in terms of the ideas, we've still got things to learn from them. Thank you.